Matthew, thank you so much for that introduction. We are so grateful to be here on this platform, speaking with everyone wherever you are in the world today. I want to wish you a happy Juneteenth, and I'm very filled to be here in this moment talking about the necessity of land to self-determination. All right. My name is Sawdayah Brownlee, and I am the board president of the Brooklyn Queens Land Trust. I have been farming and I have been with BQLT for, I've been farming since 2011 as a student, as well as a grower and a producer. And I've been with the organization with BQLT since 2015. And I became board president in 2019. Yes. And so I'm standing here, I'm sitting here with you all as someone who has been a student, a daughter, a recipient of generations of ancestral knowledge of what it means to hold space, what it means to fight for space, and with so many of the people who are on this panel as well. I think we're doing introductions first, and then we'll jump into the Juneteenth grounding. Maybe Baba Malik, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Sawdayah, and with the other panelists. My name is Malik Yakini. I'm Executive Director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And we do a number of things, including running an urban farm, D-Town Farm. We run a youth program called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program. We do various public lectures to raise consciousness about food, land, agriculture-related issues. And we're building a building called the Detroit Food Commons that will house the Detroit People's Food Co-op.
Sister Kiana, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Kiana Mickey. Folks might know me from Just Food. I was the executive director for almost 3 years and recently transitioned into a consultant role. So I still engage at Just Food in projects around fostering local supply, amplifying and influencing equitable food and farm policy on the local, state, federal, and international level. Collaborating still with farmers, continuing to find ways that we can work, train, advocate, and amplify folks that have been historically and economically divested from. What the other projects that I'm working on is working with other groups to collaborate to build capital projects and other ways to kind of shift equity from a theory to intention into straight.
Thank you, Kiana. How about Reverend Dr. Heber Brown?
Good afternoon, peace, everybody. My name is Hebert. I played high school football. I know it don't look like it, but I still remember the day when I got promoted from junior varsity to varsity. And this feels like one of those kind of moments because y'all are just amazing. And I'm grateful just to share the screen with y'all. I'm blessed to serve the Black Church Food Security Network in Baltimore. We work to organize the vast resources of Black churches and mobilize it behind Black food and land sovereignty. We have churches, seminaries, and other partners around the country who are in support of the work. And we're just grateful to contribute our part to the larger pie of Black communal self-determination, as Dr. Monica White says.
And last but not least, one of my sisters in farming, Cheryl Durant.
Hello, everybody. As Sawdayah said, I'm Cheryl Durant, and I'm here in the South Bronx of New York City. I've been an urban farmer for 10 or more years. I am the resident garden manager at Kelly Street Garden, which is a community-run project in the South Bronx in an affordable housing complex where we do food security work by growing food and distributing freely to community members who are food insecure. I'm also the food and ag coordinator at New Roots Community Farm, which is a half-acre urban farm also in the South Bronx. We also do community farming and refugee resettlement work. Last but not least, my role as president chair at Just Food. Thank you.
Hey, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you all, especially on Juneteenth. And one of the things that we wanted to start our panel with was an authentic recalling of what Juneteenth is. The common narrative is that enslaved Africans in Texas were late to the understanding that they were free based on the proclamation that was read out by General Granger in somewhere in between June 15th through June 19th, 1865. And I want to counter that understanding or that common knowledge that Black people were not freeing themselves and that we were not aware of the moves that the Union and the Confederacy were making to really just kind of counteract each other. The Civil War was not just a war between the Union and the Confederate States of America. It was also a war that involved Black people who were uprising for our freedom, which is something that never stopped from the moment we were brought to these shores. Uprisings and insurrections have characterized our time during enslavement, and in many other smaller ways we resisted. And so I'd like to recall the story of Juneteenth from one of my sister friends, Ava T. Kinsey, who is someone that I've known for some time now. We went to Howard University together. We studied under many of the same professors, so I'd like to lift up in this moment Baba Greg Kimathi Carr, as well as Baba Haile Garima, who inspired my friend Ava to do this work of restoring the true narrative of Juneteenth. And so in her words, I would like to share the work that she has done. And I also would just like to say that she is also the Associate Director of Education at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, as well as the Associate Editor of a Gathering Together literary journal. And so you can find some of her work there as well. Right. So oftentimes when we think about Juneteenth, we think of the Emancipation Proclamation freeing all of the enslaved Africans in the US. That was not the intention of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln decided to write that. It did not free anyone, actually. It did not free anyone in the Confederate States, as the Union did not have authority over the Confederate States. And it did not free any enslaved folks in the border states either. In fact, the proclamation was written and it was spread to those who could hear it to entice African people to rise up against the Confederacy. And Frederick Douglass is even quoted as saying, if they allow you to have guns, if they allow you to enlist in the Army and in the Navy, which he predicted before the proclamation was signed, do it and free ourselves by any means necessary, which is what our people did. So enslaved folks ran away to join the Union Army and the Navy after 100 years of being banned in serving in those armed forces. And we did not join so that we could be included within the narrative of the United States. Our sole purpose in joining was finding our families, bringing them back together, and fighting against the slaveocracy, which really was promoted by both sides, by the Union and the Confederacy. So we joined the Army and Navy to rebel against white supremacy and have access to artillery to find our families and free them. We see the work of Colonel Garland H. White, of Harriet Tubman, of Henry Highland Garnett, of Martin Robeson Delaney, in their ability to drum up folks who had absconded for their lives or who were freed Africans, who were free Black folks in the North. they created all Black infantries for the sole purpose of going throughout the South to free our families. One such example of that is Martin Robeson Delaney's intent. He was intent on getting to Charleston, South Carolina, and he led the 54th U.S. Colored Infantry and sacked Charleston, right? So while Juneteenth is one of our last dates as Black people in the U.S., where we were officially told that we were free, this journey to create free Black communities throughout the South really began at the beginning of the Civil War, as soon as we found avenues to escape weak spots within the Confederacy in which we could run away, gain materials needed to fight against anyone who wanted to re-enslave us. These people advocated for these all Black units specifically for that goal. And I'm saying it again because that point cannot be overemphasized enough. The Union was only concerned with reclaiming the land. And so as we see in the contemporary uprisings today, where we find some of our people who have decided to damage property, that is also a strategic point of damaging property that that impacts capitalist input and capitalist hold on our communities. It's, and this is something I know we're going to get into today on our panel. It is very, very difficult with the commodification of land for us to oftentimes own the means of production for our communities. And so if you can get at the industries that are holding those keys by burning down those resources, then that is a strategic move, right? General Granger's proclamation, the other point I just want to drive home here, was really a white flag to Black people who were in rebellion in Texas. Black folks had already heard of the Emancipation Proclamation. We had very strategic, specific channels of communication amongst each other. Many of our rebellions prior to the Civil War were inspired as well as organized with the support of folks in the Caribbean, with the support of folks who were in Mexico. And we were not strangers to this information. And so by the time that the Union arrives to Texas, they are arriving and saying, Black people, please do not take any more of this property. Do not destroy any more of this property, as the Union needed to reintegrate it back into the national economy, right? So while we were rebelling and leaving plantations, it's very important to note that we were doing so that we could reconvene as families, and so that we could really pick up the pieces of where our lives were with the interruption of enslavement, right? One other point that I want to call to our attention is there are two lines within this proclamation that states what the Union is asking for African people to do at that time. They require that Black people stay in their plantations and that they do not take up posts at any military posts. Do not go to any military posts and stay on the plantation. And that's included because that's exactly what we were doing to free ourselves. So I just wanted to ground the space with that as we talk about what are our next steps in self-determination? What are our next steps in liberating Black and Brown communities? Because we have been here before. We've done this before, and we absolutely have the resources. We have the systems to make that happen. And so I'm very glad to now open the space and get into some of these questions and the work that we're doing to continue the work of liberation. All right. So our first point of conversation, there is this rich history, as we've just recalled, of self-determination through food sovereignty and a vision for social change led by Black and Indigenous people of color communities. Can we share some of this history today? I'm gonna let someone else speak, seeing as how I've taken up a good chunk of time. Well, I think that we can we can begin with the growing and the conservation of crops that our people brought over from the various points that we were stolen from. And so when I think about the beginning of that history of self-determination surrounding food, oftentimes for me, that starts with the saving of seeds, the cultivation of crops, the telling of stories of those crops. When would we grow them? What are we using them for? What meals do we prepare with these crops? What medicines do we prepare with these crops? One particular plant for me that is just very integral to my own healing, as well as the community that I come from. My family is Gullah on both sides. My family's from South Carolina, but my dad's lineage is through the Low Country. And the plant that really resonates with me is Life Everlasting. And it is a plant that at one point used to grow wild in fields. My dad would tell me that he would just see this all the time growing up, and it was something that his great aunts and his great aunts and cousins would harvest and make it into medicine. But when I think about the degradation of the land, as Queen Quet mentioned in the intro, it's become a lot harder to find Life Everlasting. And so for us, food sovereignty, the legacy of food sovereignty as well as self-determination is in being able to cultivate those crops and also having that history, making sure that we have that information so that we can use those tools not only for our nourishment, but also for reclaiming space for ourselves.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking of what I've learned about even when Black folks who were slaves in America, the way that food was used as a way of keeping them in line and keeping folks in check, and how through resiliency, African Americans learned how to use the scraps or whatever food they could get. And what we have now is what is called soul food. And that makes me think of my own connections to my family in Jamaica. Because when I think about the question, I think about my own history and growing up in Jamaica, and the fact that my mother is a descendant of the Maroons, and how some of the cuisine that we have and some of the cuisine that we have and we share is a direct result of those guerrillas who defeated the British and lived in the mountains and were able to fend for themselves, grow food for themselves, create cuisine based on the foods that were available for them in Jamaica, and how it is still part of our culture. And to today, where we have farmers who live in a region called Cockpit Country, which is a part of Jamaica that is home to sustainable agriculture and small farmers, and is largely untouched and unmined, and how the insidiousness of capitalism and imperialism still wreaks havoc in our region today, despite the fact that we are an independent nation, and how that land is threatened by degradation and the onslaught of mining from multinational corporations. And because of a history of being resilient and fighting the British, how folks who live in the cockpit country are still fighting that fight to be able to hold on to their land, be able to farm the crops that have been farmed there for a generation, and to hold off any attempt at degrading the land by mining.
So I'll jump in and say that ever since African people have been in the so-called Western Hemisphere, we have fought for sovereignty on various levels, including food sovereignty. But I want to talk about Detroit specifically over the last 100 years or so. As most of us know, there was a great migration of Black folks from the southern part of the United States to cities like Detroit, Chicago, Gary, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, as part of the development of the automobile industry and other industries that were developing in those cities. And so those Black folks from the South brought their heritage with them, part of which included gardening or farming. And so many Black folks in Detroit, including my own grandparents, had backyard gardens, and that was just part of the culture. So that was my first exposure actually to gardening in my grandfather's backyard, who would come to Detroit in the 1920s from Georgia. And so that became part of the culture of Black folks in Detroit. In the 1960s, under Detroit's first Black mayor, Coleman Young, he started a program called the Farm-A-Lot program, where the city encouraged residents to grow gardens on vacant lots near their houses. And the city provided access to tractors and compost and topsoil and seeds and transplants. And many Black folks in the city of Detroit created gardens on what were formerly vacant lots throughout the city. And then we have within the religious community, and I'm sure Dr. Brown will speak about this more, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, which was founded in Detroit, has always made food sovereignty, or what, we weren't using that terminology at that point in time, but has made the struggle for us to be more self-reliant in terms of food one of their basic platforms. And so the Shrine of the Black Madonna first had a fairly large garden in Inkster, Michigan, which is maybe 20 or 30 miles outside of, well, not even 20 miles, maybe 10 miles outside of Detroit. And then in more recent times, they founded Beulah Land Farm in South Carolina. And then in more contemporary times, over the last 20 years ago, you have a number of Black folks in the city of Detroit who started urban farms because of the huge amount of vacant land that exists in Detroit because of the intentional disinvestment. And so when we talk about land, food sovereignty, and liberation, we're looking at both rural areas as well as urban areas.
Yep. I'm happy to jump in. When you first posed the question, one of the things that immediately strikes me is my initial entry point into the work of food and food justice was being a CSA program coordinator and learning about the history and research and connecting local farmers to folks in the city in New York City. And the more I did my research, the more I realized how much of that dominant cultural lens, even in the model of like CSA, kind of spoke or only lifted up origins of white folks and white folks using that model. And it was really kind of taking my own time in research and learning from folks that had been in this work before me to connect what I was learning as I was going around food justice and policy, and connecting to, you know, enterprise growth and cooperation. And it led me to the stories of Dr. Booker T. Whatley. It brought me back to learning more about, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think what I started to do even early on is, like, I think when we think about history, we can also not have to go that far to really see how much of our roots and our origin stories are minimized or marginalized, and how important it is that we really lift that up and amplify it and share it. And it's something that in the time of doing this work in the city, while I'm not a grower, I very much believe in innovation and in enterprise. And I am so rooted in trying to bring other folks into this work wherever their strengths lie, whether it is starting a business or you know, tapping into like proven solidarity economy models like CSA and what that could be. And I think it's important, you know, and we see it across the nation, but we should really honor and hold that and always push back when we are told like we don't have this connection to our work or history, or the models are new and they start from a certain place. There's very much deep roots and connection. We wouldn't have survived through the Jim Crow South. We wouldn't have survived through all these different times of struggle without having a connection to enterprise and supporting each other and building a multiplier effect that starts from soil, that moves to land, that moves to ownership of land, and moves to production and growing, and what that looks like and how we leverage that, because we know that to be true in this country, that this is where our power base is and how we need to continue to do that. And so I think when I look at the work, kind of like what Malik was saying, whether it's rural or urban, we always should be inspired by our history and the self-determination in our work, even if folks say that those are models that are not ours, they very much are.
I'll just add that, yeah, I appreciate, even from the very beginning, Chef Farmer Matthew dropping, and Sister Kiana just saying as well, the significance of finding the sweet spot of wherever your lane and genius might be. And for me, if I'm blooming where I'm planted as a pastor, it means combing the archives of Black church history to determine where is that as well in terms of this commitment to Black food and land sovereignty. And what we find is there are very, very deep roots there too. Many Black churches to this day are erected on ground that was given to them by a Black farmer who allowed the church to even build on that land. And the relationship between Black farmers and Black churches is a long and storied one as well, where even with respect to homecoming, traditional church celebration, there was an agricultural aspect to that as well, where those Africans who went north during the Great Migration, you come back to the home church down south, and a part of the homecoming celebration was a support on the land. Get back to the farm, help the church with the land and the garden that they have, or the farm that's in the community. And unfortunately and sadly, it's been a long neglected aspect of Black church history because especially, I believe, after the Great Migration, there was such a focus on the oratorical skills of Black men in the pulpit. And so rhetoric became the chief and champion gift, and the charismatic speakers became the most genius gifts in the church. And I think we can see from that time even to this, the preachers with the biggest stage, the pastors with the greatest influence are the ones who are no doubt gifted in oratorical skills. But I think as Baba Malik just shared, what we see in Pastor and Bishop Clegg, and what we see also in people like Pastor Vernon Johns out of Virginia, Darlington Heights, Virginia, about 80 miles southwest of Richmond, we see other models of pastoring and preaching and ministry that I believe, and I think the argument could be made, may be more useful to the moment and time that we're in. Not to discredit or throw away the oratorical skills, but after you speak, Reverend, what we gonna eat? After we gather for worship, how will we care for ourselves when service is over? And so when I think about the question of legacies around Black food and land sovereignty in my little narrow lane, I think about Pastor Vernon Johns with Farm and City Enterprises. I think about him preaching in farm boots and overalls and then selling watermelon and squash on the front porch of the church, Dexter Avenue, after worship. And my grandmama would say that church was a high cotton Black Baptist church. They did not appreciate their pastor selling watermelon on the front porch. And that was a part of what got him kicked out. But I think it's important for anybody in Black church circles and beyond to really round out the fullness, or at least a fuller picture of how we have in every arena and way as African people put energy, focus, resource, time through collective action behind Black food and land sovereignty, including through the lens of the church.
Alexis, you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure. I apologize for my lateness. I've been operating a food distribution, which I got distracted by. But my name is Alexis Mena. My pronouns are they and them. I'm an Afro-Taino aquaculturist, hydroponic farmer, and soil farmer from East New York, Brooklyn. And I'm happy to be on the panel today. My stake when it comes to food sovereignty and land is I'm a big proponent and an organizer in my community. I help put together 5 community gardens, 4 school gardens, and 2 skate parks. So I'm all about teaching people about city planning and urban planning on how to use eminent domain on their behalf and how to take over land actively in urban areas. I look forward to participating in the panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're about to transition into this next question, but one of the things I'm so moved by that I think we all lift up in the work that we do and also in the history that we have is the collective collaborative effort that we've always taken to hold on to land, to grow our own food, to nourish ourselves. It's always been a collaborative effort, and there's never one singular hero that makes that possible. And so as we're thinking about how we continue to nourish ourselves, food apartheid is the landscape of Black communities across so much of the United States. Can we speak about how this engineered structure has placed our communities in vulnerable conditions? The other thing I'm thinking about too is just, as Alexis said, the ways that we've reclaimed land that we've been told cannot be used or is being held at hostage by real estate companies that have just turned into these overgrown lots. I think a lot about the history of community gardens in New York City as well as in other urban areas, particularly within Brooklyn Queens Land Trust. These gardens were born out of a need to be able to convene in an open space, as well as be able to maintain the foodways that the folks who founded them had to the younger generation who were born in these new cities. Many of our gardeners come from the South, the Southern United States, and they also come from the Caribbean. And so those rich legacies of growing food, growing medicine, processing those plants for those things, you cannot do that without land. And many of them in the guerrilla style reclaimed those plots in that way. As capitalism works, something that has been turned over and seen to be beautiful and is now valuable now is a commodity that needs to be taken back by large corporations and states. And so what community gardeners in this city have done is they collaborated on such a grand scale across boroughs, which is a big deal here, to collaborate across boroughs and say, we are going to hold on to this land and you cannot just take it from us when we've spent 10, 15, 20, 30 years developing this as a cultural institution in our neighborhoods, where we've gathered for birthday parties and anniversaries and wedding receptions, right? So, the collaborative aspect is the thing that I think is really important to note, as well as understanding that if we are going to hold on to something as precious, as important as land within a capitalist economy, what are the systems and the structures that we can use to support us being able to hold on to that? And that is one of the reasons why the community gardeners from the Bronx to Queens decided to organize themselves into land trusts, because the land trust model allows the community gardeners to hold on to that property in perpetuity as gardens, right? And when I think about that, when I think about the history of redlining Black and brown people out of land ownership, higher interest rates on loans to acquire land, I think that is a model that that made a lot of sense, and in a number of ways still makes sense for Black and Brown people to hold on to land collectively. One of the things that I was so intrigued by when I first joined the organization was that our board of directors is, we were able to cap it at 15, but the majority of the board has to be members of gardeners within the network, which was so stunning to me, because it dawned on me then that if the majority of our board has to be garden members, then that means the majority of the people who have a controlling power within the organization are people from the community. They should be mostly Black and Brown people, as those are that's our demographic within BQLT. And these are people who either founded those gardens or are descendants of people who founded those gardens or of those neighborhoods, right? So for me, that was just very striking. Being someone that has witnessed the loss of land through internal divisions once heirs property comes into play, as being someone who has seen that, seeing folks work in a collaborative way, in a trusting way, to hold on to land for those purposes, I thought was really just incredible. Yeah.
I just want to echo that sentiment. That's exactly my experience as well. Growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, being of Haitian and Dominican descent, having family that came from a lineage of farmers, we very much, were living in a community that was suffering from a food apartheid. But growing up, I had the privilege of, being part of a family that were property owners and had a backyard and were able to grow food back there and had connections close enough to the people who were importing food to be able to provide our own family with clean nutrition food, while when I was going over to my friend's house, I would be fed chicken nuggets and fries, and I thought that was, I swore that this was what being American was, and how we need to be acclimated. And I saw my mom and my uncles as being old timers, because all they would care about was fruits and vegetables. So I think that there's a psychological gambit that we need to really get over and understand, and how the anti-Blackness inside of Black and Brown communities is what sometimes perpetuates this food apartheid. Being someone of Latinx descent, I think that a lot of the times, there isn't enough reaching across the board to really understand how do we as people start really working together outside of these white supremacist structures and the disenfranchisement that we find our communities in, because even our Asian brothers and sisters have been able to create a strong network and be able to import hundreds and hundreds of pounds of food from China on a weekly basis. What does it mean that we've been here equally as long, if not longer, and we're not building our own system, right? So there's obviously a gap in the way we organize and in the way we are moving, not to mention disenfranchisement that we suffer through. But for us to really be able to pull ourselves out of this, I think that it needs to be working with ourselves first, Black folk first, and then reaching across the other communities of color to understand how do we really build networks far, wide, and deeply rooted in struggle.
I think the term food apartheid, or as we say in Jamaica, food apartheid, is such the right description for what I see happening in my own community, and how it directly relates to the health and wellness of the folks that live in my community and how they integrate with the larger society. I see that in the disproportionate health disparities that we have in our community, and as what we eat affects how we sleep, how we work, how we see ourselves. And living in the South Bronx, or living in the Bronx with a history of the decade of fire, compounded by the history of the decade of fire, exacerbates these disparities. And what I see from the Decade of Fire, what I see building from that is still resiliency, because all those buildings that were burnt down, all those vacant lots that were a result of buildings burning down, were turned into places where people could reclaim land and grow food, which says to me that despite the generations of trauma that we as Black and brown folks have gone through, we do not forget our connection to food, and how much that connection to food means not only our outer freedom, but our inner freedom, and that we can claim these rubbled and garbage-strewn lands and turn them into places of beauty and turn them into places of production, so that we can feed members of our community. Even though we don't own this land, even though it may be owned by the city or other developers, we make the statement that we are reclaiming this land for our community to grow food. And from working with my community, I can see what a transformative effect it has on folks when they come on this land and they put their hand in the soil. And I don't know if it's, maybe it's a part of our DNA that a certain line of remembrance happens when people start to farm on the land, where they remember connections to their own family, connections to their own family around the importance of food, and remembering that they came from a place, or they remembered a time when this was important. And and how important it is to connect to the land and have this be a part of our remembrance and our lineage. And I totally identify with what Alex said, because immigrating from Jamaica to America and growing up in a place where we had a backyard garden, where my father was a farmer, and we looked down on that as children as a path, a career path, and coming to the United States, where going to college, the biggest thing for me was actually to eat a McDonald's, or to eat chicken nuggets, and thinking that was, and the indoctrination is so strong that I thought that was superior to what I had learned and what I had known, and how destructive that type of imperialistic indoctrination is. So part of it is also an immense amount of unlearning and an immense amount of empathy, and that we have to bring to our community around land and food, and to draw them back into it. Because it's not only, the trauma is so deep and so embedded that just thinking that we can just do is easy. No, we can't. It is not easy for us to just do and change the paradigm so easily, because it's so deep and it is so entrenched that sometimes it feels like the wall is so thick that we may not ever be able to break from it. And I feel that the only way that we can actually begin to do that is to actually draw people back to some portion of the land and have them literally put their hands in the soil to begin that type of transformation. It's not just a question of activism and advocacy. It's also a beginning of developing a spiritual being, because the work that we do is deeply, deeply spiritual. And we must never forget that, because what capitalism and imperialism does is that it separates us from that spirituality, where everything is connected and everything is alive. When I look at capitalism, I see it not only as commodification, but it's a doctrine that believes that everything is dead and everything must be extracted to the last dollar, and nothing is worthwhile. Nothing can be worthwhile, and nothing can have any resonance if our first instinct of our planet and of people and of animals is that we look at it as dead.
A couple of things I'd like to add to the discussion. Yes, community land trusts are important and we should support them, and they're not enough. And so it's important that we realize that the situation of food apartheid is the result of systemic causes. It's not the result of just our own lack of initiative. It's a result of an ongoing war on our communities. It's a result of disinvestment. And so the solution, the ultimate solution to the problem is a fundamental shift in power in American society. Back in the day, we used to call it revolution. That's not a term that's really popular these days, but ultimately we have to be talking about a shift in power and a shift in resources. And part of that includes the ongoing call for reparations. So our reparations needs to not just include cash payments, but it needs to include land as well. And now I want to just complicate the discussion a bit more and say that the concept of land ownership is fundamentally a European concept. And while it's important in the state that we're in now as a people that we own land in the short term, in the long term, as we're looking at developing societies that are a reflection of our highest values, this idea of individual ownership of land is something that we really need to get rid of. And we need to go back to the way our ancestors and most indigenous people saw land. And that is that we are perhaps the guardians of it, the caretakers of it, but we certainly are not the owners of it, where it can be passed down through our lives, usually through men, usually from father to son. We need to get away from those concepts and really think about land in a much more holistic way and in a much less extractive way. So yes, in the short term, we need to be trying to see how we so-called own land, but in the long term, we need to be trying to see how we have collective use of it and collective guardianship of the land.
Exactly. I think that that is very key to the way in which we interact with land, and it's very key to the overall, or at least for me, and probably most everyone here today, that long-term goal of liberation, right? So we don't want to replicate or continue the systems that we're currently living under. And to do so would be to continue to live under a system of enslavement. So how and what are the things that we want to build on? How are we going to develop systems that free the land, that free the people? And this is our last question. I really feel like that just speaks to Baba Malik really just ushered us into this. Can you speak on the frameworks that nurture long-term solutions for health and well-being through a food web that's rooted in justice, right? How are we transitioning to this space? And I see it very much as a work in progress, where we are slashing and burning what doesn't work, what's not feeding us. We're letting the soil lie fallow. We're allowing it to regenerate. And this is a cumulative process that has to happen over time. It's rooted in relationships. It's rooted in how we bring people back to the soil, as Cheryl said. How are we making sure that people are reconnected on a very visceral way, and invested in liberation that doesn't look like anything that we see right now, that is something that we have to connect back to in an epigenetic way, right? Because when we're speaking of the ways in which our ancestors, before this episodic challenge that we're in right now, the ways that our ancestors held space for one another, all of the different types of people that we were, that looked, when we look at the history, that looked like equity, that looked like learning how to cultivate yourself through the ecosystems that you're in, learning from also our non-human communities. So how, I'm always grappling with this question because, the land trust model is dependent on us procuring capital and holding on to it. And if we don't pay certain violations and fines, we'll get a lien on the property. And if the lien is there too long, you lose the property, right? So it is by no means a solid, secure point of holding on to space. And I guess what I'm saying is I really don't have the answer to that question. I just I'm working in organizations and with people so that we can cultivate ourselves as well as cultivate critical connections on land that can lead us to getting closer to that long end goal of being able to be in community with each other without these licenses and restraints that really exhaust the earth.
I mean, to me today, what it sounds like you're referencing, and I think what's been coming up is where we are at right now. We're still working under a system of oppression. It's just another aspect of capitalism that then permeates into our food system. And so it does continue to divest us from land. And kind of like what Malik was saying, what connects to me or what lifts up is there's the elements around going back to our resilient cultural regenerative practices around soil, but also around moving back to a paradigm where there was a collective ownership or expression of that land. We were stewards of that land. And I really do see us now in these days as stewards of our lands. We're living ancestors. I see Harlem as ancestral land right now. And in the 5 boroughs, I see Detroit as ancestral land. And I think there are some of the intersections to building this is building on proven models that we know are resilient and strong, that have kept our ancestors thriving and moving throughout struggles, and also seeing how we can connect that to things like policy and pushing. And I think this is some of those times that when we're pushing back on these capitalist systems that tell us we can't own our land, or we need licenses, or we need capital in order to be strong. I think these are the times where we can see from each other, learn from city to city and state to state, what's precedence and what's been proven, so we can dismantle the policies and the inequity that persists, the food apartheid that we're living in. Policies like keeping us from building enterprise on community land. And telling us that we can't build enterprise or sell or figure out ways to build profits that are still good and put people first and land first, because it then takes away from the commons. I think these are the times that we can push back and challenge and really think about how the policies that have been keeping us apart or keeping us from being able to grow and own or find ways to come back to, vibrant collective ownership. These are the times that we can really connect and undo that on the hyper-local level and even the federal level. And I think there's opportunities around policy where we've been historically divested from and kept from through violence, through economies that we know the importance of capital, we know the importance of exchange and revenue to support the work that we do and the intersection of that work. And we also know how important or how much we've been pushed out of policy to be decision makers. So we're not there, and then those policies then further oppress. And I think these are the times that we can connect from growers to policymakers to activists and everything in between. And food is that connection and that driver that we're able to influence and build on the policies and connections and make a better bridge to what we know to be true in our practices, and to make sure that those are the policies that support our resilient neighborhoods and communities. And these are the things that we should learn from each other to lift that up from the ground up. And we should continue to push back anytime that we're told like policy isn't an opportunity or part of the solidarity economy that we're building. It's a part of it.
Yeah, I'd love to echo what Kiana is saying. I think that, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top is self-actualization, but actually Maslow studied under the Blackfoot people, indigenous folk, and at the top of their pyramid was actually communal actualization, right? So what does it look like for us to take self-actualization to a next level and work towards the communal liberation, spiritual, psychological, and physical liberation of our people, putting indigenous practices first for the regeneration of ourselves and our land, and really be able to understand that these ancient technologies that and knowledge that have been available to us for so long is eventually what we need to be returning to as a blueprint and as a framework for us to really have a clear future, right? So I think that in a lot of ways there needs to be more study and more dedication. I love to see, you know, book clubs dedicated to just indigenous practices and indigenous knowledge, so that we can really start fostering and understanding that, like, these you know, societies and universities we've created are not going to be able to bring together the knowledge, the ideologies that we need to follow, right? Those are deeply rooted in our own cultures and deeply rooted in our own people. So uplifting that is where we're going to be able to get to the next level. I really am a firm believer that the future is about decentralizing power, doing away with hierarchies, and moving together as a people in more cooperative models. And as Kiana said, that solidarity economy that we're building, that we have been building, and that's the only way we're going to be able to push forward. You know, I think that ultimately land is the most powerful tool for people to have, but we have to also be in relationship with land and not think of ourselves as the owners of that land, or else we become as bad as the enemy. So it really takes a larger conversation for us to really transform our intrinsic values, our foundational values as people, to be able to have a better idea on how is it that we move forward while transforming ourselves as well. Thank you.
I'm loving the encouragement for study in books, in wisdom that's not rooted in Western imperialism. And if I could just offer up Amos Wilson and his work, Blueprint for Black Power, and so many other dynamic ancestors have written extensively on these kinds of moments and these challenges that we're facing. And one of the things that I saw in his work and in the works of others, even Marimba Ani, Herbert, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, and so many others, there's reference to the church over and over and over again. Now, people see a Baptist preacher coming and say, oh, Lord, here he is. He's going to come try to get us to come to church. But if I could ask you to put all the religious stuff to the side for a minute, just put it to the side. And from the same lens that we're talking about now, from a socio-political revolutionary lens, look at, lift up this idea of collective ownership, this idea of collective guardianship, this idea of organizing resources to meet the everyday needs of the people. Might I offer that if you strip away all the overt religious symbolism and put it to the side, that in many churches we get a running start there. And I don't think Dr. Amos Wilson was a deacon in nobody's church, but I think that the way that he was looking at, and others, Carter G. Woodson writes about the Black church extensively as well, that if this institutional power base has been around since the late 1700s to now, and has had the ability to withstand arson, assassination of its leaders. The Charleston Nine, just the other day, we were commemorating our dearly beloved now ancestors who were killed in Bible study in Charleston. Now, through all of this institution gets burned down, bounces back, leaders gets killed, bounces back, and we get the practice week by week of putting our money in a common pot, of tending and caring for property like that church kitchen and that bus that sits in the parking lot, and then bury our beloveds in the ground and care for the cemetery outside the window of the building. I only offer that it might be something to consider, at least for some people, that this could be amazing organizing ground with respect to nurturing and cultivating an institutional power base. So in fact, the reason why, and I gotta just be honest, Baba, Malik, and the rest of the family at the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, they're our parents. I was 24, 25 years old, went to a conference where Baba Malik was the keynote speaker, and I got baptized, converted, and the Holy Ghost that night, and came back like, I want to be him. And then studying his work with Freedom Schools and the like, and I was already engaged with Freedom Schools as well in Baltimore. I saw a mirror in him to my life, and the inspiration from their organization planted the seed here in Baltimore. And the reason why I put the seed in the bosom of the Black church was because I've not seen any other institution, multi-generational, resourced, puts at least some coins in the basket, can feed folk, can show up at the birth and the funeral. I've not seen that as, there's other places for sure, but I'm just saying in terms of an institutional space, I think that it's a great potential there for something that can be around here long after we've all transitioned. And so that's something to consider as well. And I pray to do all that I can, especially right now. Now, I know time is on us. Many pastors are reconsidering their real estate right now because their congregations cannot gather in the buildings. And they're trying to think about, what can I do with this building? What can I do with this land? Family, there is a window of opportunity here right now that if we can just bring these conversations closer together, I think we can check off a number of the boxes. It will not be a panacea by far, but it'll check off a number of the boxes in terms of where we're gonna get the money from, where we're gonna meet, how we're gonna eat, where's the land that's needed. And so I pray to follow in the line of Albert Clegg, Vernon Johns, Fannie Lou Hamer, and so many others as pertains of that spiritual, religious organizing and church space, and hopefully come to you with, hey, y'all got the keys to the bus and the kitchen, let's do it.
I just want to say we could go on and hold space and commune for so long because there's so much to talk about, and this issue is so deep, and it's also so nuanced, right? I know we are a little short on time, and I want to make sure that Baba Malik and Cheryl, did you speak? We just have time for some quick closing remarks. But I'm so grateful that we've been able to hold space together.
The only thing I have to add to this is that what everybody had just said is a great advertisement for solidarity economies and resource-based economies. I mean, we know it. It's come together and to begin to implement these strategies. Nothing else to say.
And by encouraging people to stay encouraged. And we're living in a very special time right now. And much of the work that we've been doing for years, now the ears of the people are much more open to this kind of work. And so both the COVID pandemic and also the mass protests that we're seeing against police murder are causing people to look at efforts to create Black food sovereignty in a much more favorable light. And so I'm not a Christian preacher like my brother, but I think Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said something like, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. And so we have to always keep that in mind, and we can see that happening before our eyes. So we need to redouble our efforts. We need to stay encouraged, and people are beginning to come around, and I think we're going to see shifts in our community and shifts in power.
Yeah. I would just add to that, I think, you know, what speaks to me, and I love that we're talking about power, and I think if we're evoking some of our ancestors, we should also evoke Diane Nash and Ella Baker and really think about how we're moving forward in a leaderful way, where there's space and change agents in all of us, and we don't deem any one person or hierarchy of this power or hierarchy in this landscape and who takes the clout and who takes the resources, but it actually, all of our work is moving forward through dissemination of power and resources equitably and well and regenerative. And we need to see women, we need to see LGBTQ folk, we need to see trans, we need to see elders, and we need to see youth and young leaders. And I'm really excited about the panel coming up with Christina Ayashima. I mean, those are two women that I definitely see as leaders, just like I see you and I see Cheryl. But I think across this, let's continue to lift up ourselves as change makers and lift each other up as leaders in this leaderful movement, because that will be the way we move forward and build solidarity. There's no one or two of us.
Word, word, absolutely to everything. I'm so grateful that you all answered my call, my text, my email to join me on this panel. I have always wanted to meet Reverend Dr. Heber, so I'm so excited that I was able to be in space with you. To my very first Black agricultural mentor, Baba Malik, thank you for taking a chance on me when I emailed you out of the blue in 2012. And to my good friends and comrades here in New York, Kiana, Cheryl, Alexis, we have worked together in so many ways, systematically, as well as growing food together. And I thank you all for being here. We are going to transition over to Chef Farmer Matthew, and he is our master of ceremonies for this Juneteenth broadcast. So excited for the rest of the day, and thank you so much.
Thank you.